Princess Anne emerged from Windsor Castle at 11:22 this morning, her face set in an expression those who know her recognized immediately as controlled devastation. The emergency family meeting she'd just left had lasted 4 hours and ended with a decision so difficult that even Anne, famous for her emotional restraint, struggled to maintain composure. What she's about to announce will change the royal family forever. The meeting that was never supposed to happen. The message did not arrive loudly, nor did it arrive widely. It moved instead through a narrow corridor of authority that existed precisely for moments when routine collapsed. Those who received it recognized the format immediately. There was no subject line, no justification, no softening language, only an instruction, brief and unmistakable, that presence was required at Windsor as soon as dawn allowed. No one needed to ask why, but by the time the eastern sky had begun to lighten, movement was already underway across private roads and secured entrances that rarely appeared on maps. Vehicles arrived separately, deliberately staggered, without escorts or visible security details. This was not a matter of discretion for appearances. It was discretion for control. Princess Anne entered the meeting room before anyone else, carrying no papers and making no calls. She did not review notes because she had asked for none. What she required at this stage was not briefing but alignment. She took her seat at the long table without ceremony and waited. King Charles III arrived next. His expression reflected exhaustion rather than alarm, the look of someone who had spent the night absorbing information rather than reacting to it. He paused briefly at the doorway, taking in the room as if measuring its capacity to hold what was about to be discussed. Then he sat, setting aside the usual markers of hierarchy in favor of immediacy. Prince William came last. He arrived without staff, without folders, without the outward signals of preparation that usually accompanied his engagements. His presence carried a different weight this morning. He was not there as an observer or apprentice. He was there because the matter under discussion directly touched on the future. What did not arrive was just as telling, as no communications officials were waiting to shape language. No legal advisors are positioned to identify risk. No aides were hovering near the door in case instructions were needed. The room had been stripped of everything that might soften or redirect the conversation. This was not a meeting about response, it was a meeting about reckoning. The setting itself reinforced that reality. The curtains were drawn not for secrecy, but for focus. The table was bare. No water glasses, no folders, no briefing packs arranged with precision. The space had been intentionally emptied of comfort. The message was implicit. This was not a discussion meant to be prolonged. For a moment, no one spoke. That pause was not hesitation. It was a recalibration as each person present understood that they were no longer operating within the usual parameters of palace decision-making. The familiar sequence of options, delay, adjustment, and managed disclosure had been exhausted elsewhere. What remained was choice. The information that had prompted the gathering had arrived late the previous evening, delivered through professional channels that left no room for interpretation. It had not been filtered through advisors or softened by conditional language. It had come directly accompanied by documentation that closed doors rather than opening them. This was not an alert. It was a conclusion. King Charles broke the stillness with a question that carried neither defensiveness nor strategy. He wanted to know whether silence remained an option, not whether it was preferable or convenient or advisable, but whether it was still possible without consequence. The answer did not require debate. It was already evident in the faces around the table. Princess Anne answered first, though she did not frame her response as an instruction. She stated plainly that silence had already begun to cause damage. What had once been discretion had become misrepresentation through inertia. The institution, she said, was now at risk not because of the circumstances themselves, but because of how long they had been held apart from public understanding. Prince William listened closely, his attention fixed on the progression being outlined rather than the personalities in the room. He understood that the significance of this meeting lay not in the facts alone, but in the timing. Whatever decision emerged would not exist in isolation. It would establish a precedent for how truth was handled when it could no longer be shaped. As the details were reviewed, the nature of the problem was clarified. This was not a crisis that could be absorbed quietly. It was not a situation that would resolve itself if given space. The implications extended beyond immediate family concern into the architecture of responsibility and continuity. Each participant recognized that the question was no longer whether the truth would surface, but how distorted it would become if the family did not take ownership of it. The longer the knowledge was delayed, the more narrative control would shift elsewhere. Princess Anne focused on that risk with characteristic directness. She reminded the others that history rarely judged institutions for facing tragedy. It judged them for evasion. In moments like this, she said, credibility was not preserved by caution, but by clarity. No disagreement was voiced, but a visible adjustment was made. The realization settled that the mechanisms the family had relied on for decades were insufficient for what lay ahead. This was not a situation that could be managed with incremental disclosure or carefully staged reassurance. Prince William's posture changed subtly as the meeting progressed. He was no longer absorbing information. He was anticipating a consequence. He understood that the decisions made in this room would accelerate his own transition in ways that preparation alone could not soften. By the time the discussion reached its natural conclusion, the meeting had shifted in character. What began as an urgent gathering had become a moment of institutional self-definition. The participants were no longer asking how to proceed. They were deciding who they were willing to be seen as when the truth was spoken. Only one question remained unresolved. Not whether acknowledgement would come, but who could deliver it without dilution, defensiveness, or misdirection. The answer did not need to be stated aloud. The room, almost unanimously, turned toward Princess Anne, the line that cannot be crossed. Princess Anne waited longer than anyone expected before speaking. She allowed the silence to settle, not out of hesitation but intention. In that pause, the room recalibrated. The urgency that had drawn them together gave way to something more exacting: attention. When she finally spoke, it was without preface. She did not summarize what had already been said or acknowledge the gravity of the situation. She addressed instead the framework through which it had been approached until now. The family, she stated plainly, had exhausted the usefulness of management. Whatever this moment had been initially, it was no longer logistical or presentational. It had crossed into moral territory, and moral territory did not respond to strategy. Her authority was not asserted. It was assumed. Decades of service had given her a rare position within the family, one built not on affection or fear, but reliability. She was known for consistency rather than persuasion. When she intervened, it was understood that she did so only when the delay itself had become a decision. Anne outlined the narrowing reality with clinical precision. The family had two remaining options. They could speak with accuracy and restraint, or they could allow the truth to arrive through fragmentation, shaped by others with less information and fewer constraints. There was no third path. Time, she emphasized, was no longer neutral. It was actively eroding credibility. King Charles listened without interruption. Those present noticed the absence of resistance. Earlier in his reign, he had been inclined to weigh decisions against precedent, to move incrementally where possible. Now there was no incremental space left. His stillness suggested not indecision, but recognition. The situation had advanced beyond the point where caution served its intended purpose. Anne turned her attention to Prince William, not with instruction but inclusion. She spoke to him as someone whose future would be directly shaped by what happened next. The institution, she reminded him, could survive loss. What it could not survive was the impression that it avoided truth when truth became inconvenient. The residue of such moments lingered far longer than the moments themselves. This reframing altered the dynamic in the room. The discussion moved away from consequence management and toward responsibility. Anne made it clear that the goal was not to protect the family from discomfort. It was to protect the institution from corrosion. The critical shift came when she defined the boundaries of what could be said publicly. The statement, she insisted, must not minimize the reality of the situation. It must not imply that outcomes remained uncertain when they did not. And it must not suggest that deliberation was ongoing if deliberation had already concluded. Any of those would constitute misdirection, whether intended or not. Her clarity disrupted the lingering instinct to shield by omission. She reframed disclosure not as exposure, but stewardship. The monarchy, she said, had never survived by pretending to be untouched by difficulty. It survived by demonstrating that it could face difficulty without distortion. There was unease in the room, though no one voiced it directly. The discomfort was not rooted in disagreement, but in consequence. Once the truth was spoken plainly, it could not be retrieved or reframed. Anne acknowledged that fear without conceding to it. She reminded them that permanence was not a future risk, it was a present condition. The events under discussion had already occurred. The only choice remaining was whether acknowledgement would be shaped by integrity or by calculation. History, she noted quietly, was rarely forgiving of the latter. As the conversation turned toward the practical question of who should deliver the message, Anne did not immediately offer herself. She allowed the question to linger. In that space, the answer became obvious without being stated. Her credibility in moments of institutional strain was widely recognized, not only within the family but beyond it. She was perceived as neither sentimental nor self-protective, a distinction that mattered profoundly now. When she did agree to speak, it was conditional. The statement would be factual and contained. It would avoid conjecture entirely. It would not gesture toward future updates or speculative improvement, and it would be delivered without emotional display. Tragedy, Anne insisted, did not require embellishment to be understood. Prince William acknowledged this with a single nod. That gesture carried more weight than any verbal agreement. It signaled acceptance not only of the plan, but of the philosophical shift it represented. This was no longer about preserving comfort, it was about preventing further harm. With that, the meeting concluded. There were no closing remarks, no attempts at reassurance. The path forward had narrowed decisively. Princess Anne would speak. The family would stand behind her words without qualification, and whatever consequences followed would be met without revision. As they left the room, there was no sense of relief. Relief would have implied resolution, and there was none. What existed instead was resolved. The tragedy itself had not been created in that space, but its acknowledgement would begin there, shaped by a line Princess Anne had drawn and refused to let anyone cross. The news no one was prepared to hear. The confirmation did not arrive as a dramatic announcement. It arrived as a conclusion. That distinction mattered deeply to Princess Anne, who insisted the family confront the moment without the comfort of euphemism. What was placed before them was not a sudden reversal, but the end point of a trajectory that had been quietly unfolding behind layers of caution and restraint. The briefing materials were precise and unsentimental. They outlined a progression that could no longer be interpreted generously. Medical assessments that once left room for adjustment had now converged. What remained uncertain was no longer the outcome, but duration. And even that uncertainty had narrowed enough to strip away illusion. Princess Anne requested that the sequence of developments be reviewed from the beginning, not because she lacked familiarity, but because she wanted absolute clarity. She had learned over years of institutional service that ambiguity, even when unintentional, became a liability the moment it left the room. If the family was going to speak publicly, every word would be weighed against what they already knew privately. As the timeline was restated, the emotional temperature in the room changed almost imperceptibly. The earlier months, once framed as cautious optimism, now read as postponement. Decisions that had felt prudent at the time proved to be temporary shelters against inevitability. No one present could escape the realization that hope had been doing work it was never meant to carry alone. The development itself concerned a senior figure whose role extended far beyond family bonds. This was not a situation confined to private grief. It touched continuity, expectation, and the psychological center of the monarchy. The implications radiated outward, affecting not only immediate relationships, but also the pace at which responsibility would need to be assumed elsewhere. Prince William absorbed this in silence. He had been aware that matters were serious, but the framing stripped away any remaining buffer. This was no longer about preparing emotionally for a possible future. It was about accepting that the future was arriving on terms not of their choosing. The distance between personal life and public duty collapsed further at that moment. King Charles spoke quietly, choosing his words with care, reflecting both experience and fatigue. He acknowledged that earlier choices had been made with the intention of preserving stability. There had been a genuine belief that discretion served compassion. What he recognized now, with visible difficulty, was that discretion had reached its limit. Princess Anne responded not with criticism, but with reframing. She stated plainly that discretion had transformed into distortion. The longer the truth remained unspoken, the more harmful its eventual emergence would become. The family was no longer protecting anyone by waiting. They were increasing the damage that silence would cause. This marked the emotional pivot of the meeting. The shift was not dramatic, but it was decisive. What had begun as an assessment became an acknowledgement. The tragedy was no longer abstract. It had a shape, a direction, and consequences that would not pause for institutional readiness. Anne emphasized that the language used publicly could not suggest reversibility. To do so would invite false hope, and false hope, she argued, was cruelty disguised as kindness. The gravity of this realization settled slowly. For a family trained to manage perception, accepting that some truths resist management was profoundly unsettling, yet no one argued. The facts, once spoken aloud, carried their own authority. The final question raised in that chapter of the meeting was not whether the news would be shared, but how it would be shared without softening its reality or amplifying its pain. Anne made it clear that restraint, not reassurance, would be the guiding principle. The public did not need consolation. They needed honesty. By the time the discussion concluded, the emotional weight of the news had been fully absorbed. It was not met with visible collapse, but with something more enduring: resolve. The understanding that this moment would define not only the coming weeks, but the moral posture of the family long after. Fallout inside the royal family. The consequences of acknowledgement began unfolding before any statement was issued. Within the household, the atmosphere shifted in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to miss. Conversations slowed. Movements became deliberate. There was a sense that everyone understood they were standing at the edge of something irreversible. For some members of the family, the meeting forced a confrontation with fears they had kept carefully compartmentalized. For others, it confirmed suspicions they had not wanted to voice. The shared experience was not shock but exposure. The protective distance between anticipation and acceptance had dissolved. Prince William retreated from view in the hours following the meeting, not as an act of avoidance, but necessity. Those close to him later described a man recalibrating in real time. The responsibilities he had long prepared for now pressed closer, no longer theoretical, no longer remote. The weight of them was immediate and personal. King Charles remained visible, though quieter than usual. His interactions with advisors were methodical, focused on continuity rather than reassurance. He understood that leadership in moments like this required steadiness, not sentiment. His demeanor communicated something important to those watching closely. The institution would not fracture under the strain of truth. Princess Anne, having accepted the role of messenger, moved into a different mode entirely. She reviewed drafts with precision that bordered on severity. Each phrase was examined not for how it sounded, but for what it allowed others to infer. She rejected language that implied possibility where none existed, and cautioned against phrasing that invited speculation through omission. Within the family, generational differences became more visible. Older members, shaped by decades of instinctive restraint, struggled with the pace at which events were now accelerating. They had been trained to believe that time was a tool. Younger members recognized that time, in this instance, had become an adversary. Private discussions surfaced long-standing philosophical divisions about transparency and modernization. These were not arguments, but reckonings. Decisions made years earlier were re-evaluated under the harsh clarity of present consequence. Some acknowledged privately that caution had slipped into avoidance. Others recognized that their calls for openness carried costs they had not fully considered. Princess Anne addressed these tensions directly in a smaller gathering later that day. She made it clear that disagreement was not disloyalty, but inconsistency would be disastrous. Once the statement was delivered, there could be no internal contradiction. The family would stand together publicly, even if private emotions remained unsettled. The ripple effects extended beyond the immediate family. Senior staff adjusted schedules quietly. Protocols that had been theoretical were activated without announcement. The machinery of the institution responded not with alarm, but with controlled adaptation. This was not a crisis of chaos, it was a crisis of gravity. As evening approached, a sense of waiting settled over the household. The statement was finalized, the timing was agreed. Nothing remained to be negotiated. Those present understood that once spoken, the words would alter the landscape permanently. There was no belief that acknowledgement would ease the pain ahead, but there was a shared understanding that refusal to acknowledge would corrode trust beyond repair. The family had crossed from preservation into responsibility. The tragedy itself had not been created by speaking. It had existed already, pressing against silence. What changed now was that the family had chosen to meet it openly, without disguise. And once that choice was made, there could be no return to the comfort of not knowing. The statement that changed everything. The decision to have Princess Anne speak publicly was not ceremonial. It was strategic, deliberate, and rooted in an understanding of how credibility functions when trust is strained. Inside the family, there was a quiet consensus that no one else could deliver the message without it being filtered through expectation, sympathy, or suspicion. Anne's reputation for directness was not merely an asset. That was the point. The statement was scheduled for late morning, timed carefully but without the usual choreography that accompanied major royal communications. There would be no advance briefing for favored correspondence, no background reassurance delivered through unnamed sources. Princess Anne insisted that the words stand on their own, unshielded by interpretation. If the truth were to be acknowledged, it would not arrive softened by intermediaries. In the hours leading up to the announcement, Anne reviewed the final text alone. She declined the presence of communications aides, asking instead for silence and space. This was not an act of defiance, but of concentration. She understood that every word would be parsed not only for meaning but for intent. Ambiguity, even accidental, would be treated as evasion. The statement itself was spare, almost austere. It opened without preamble, without expressions of gratitude or appeals for understanding. Anne identified the development directly, confirming that the family was facing circumstances that had progressed beyond earlier expectations. She acknowledged the seriousness without dramatization, choosing clarity over comfort. What the statement did not include was as important as what it did. There were no timelines offered, no projections framed as possibilities, and language that invited speculation or false reassurance. She did not promise updates. She did not suggest that matters were under review. The absence of such phrases was intentional. To include them would have been dishonest. Anne spoke slowly, her tone measured and unadorned. There was no visible emotion, but neither was there detachment. The gravity of the moment was conveyed through restraint rather than display. Those watching understood instinctively that this was not a performance. It was an acknowledgement. At one point, Anne paused briefly, not to gather herself, but to ensure precision. She clarified that the family had chosen to speak now because silence no longer served the public or themselves. That sentence, delivered without emphasis, carried more weight than any expression of sorrow could have. It framed the statement not as a concession, but as a responsibility. The reaction was immediate and profound. Within minutes, the statement's language was circulating globally, quoted verbatim across platforms. Analysts noted the absence of euphemism. Commentators remarked on the lack of narrative framing. For a public accustomed to carefully managed royal messaging, the starkness of the delivery was disorienting. Yet it was precisely that disorientation that recalibrated trust. By refusing to shape emotional response, Anne allowed the facts to speak. The public was not instructed on how to feel. They were simply informed. Inside the household, the moment of delivery marked a shift from anticipation to consequence. There was no applause when Anne concluded, no exchange of relief. Those present understood that acknowledgement was not an endpoint. It was a threshold. King Charles was informed immediately once the statement concluded. He did not request revisions or clarifications. He accepted the moment as final. His response, according to those present, was a quiet affirmation. The family had done what was required, not what was comfortable. Prince William, watching from a private setting, reportedly remained silent for several minutes after the broadcast ended. For him, the statement represented a narrowing of the distance between present responsibility and future role. What had been acknowledged publicly would now shape every private decision. Public response evolved rapidly. Initial shock gave way to sober analysis. There was little outrage, surprisingly little speculation. The clarity of the statement appeared to have constrained excess. By naming the situation without embellishment, Anne had limited the space in which rumor could thrive. Medical experts, constitutional scholars, and commentators across disciplines noted the unusual candor. Some questioned whether the family had waited too long. Others observed that speaking earlier might not have changed the outcome, only the timing of reckoning. What united most reactions was recognition that the moment had been handled with gravity rather than calculation. Anne did not engage further after the statement. She declined interviews. She issued no follow-up commentary. Her role, as she understood it, was complete. To continue speaking would dilute the clarity she had established. In the days that followed, the statement would be referenced repeatedly as a turning point, not because of its content alone, but because of what it represented: a willingness to acknowledge limitations, a refusal to trade honesty for comfort. For Princess Anne, the task had never been about managing reaction. It had been about marking a line between silence and truth. Once crossed, there could be no retreat. The statement did not resolve the tragedy it acknowledged. It did something more enduring. It altered the relationship between the family and the public by demonstrating that, when required, candor would prevail over preservation. And in that shift, the institution took on a different weight, more fragile perhaps, but also more credible. What happens after tragedy? After the statement, there was no return to routine. The idea of normality, so often invoked after royal crises, did not apply here. What Princess Anne had confirmed did not cause chaos, but it altered the family's internal rhythm in ways that could not be reversed. A line had been crossed not by circumstance alone, but by choice. And choice, once exercised publicly, reshapes everything that follows. Inside the household, the first change was the silence of a different kind. Not the heavy avoidance that had preceded acknowledgement, but a quieter, more deliberate stillness. Conversations became fewer and more purposeful. Decisions that might once have been deferred were addressed directly. The illusion of time as a buffer was gone. For Princess Anne, the aftermath was not about visibility, but stewardship. Having spoken once, she withdrew deliberately. There would be no clarification interviews, no softening remarks offered to reassure audiences or commentators. Her philosophy was simple. Truth, once stated plainly, did not require maintenance through repetition. To elaborate would invite reinterpretation, and reinterpretation would weaken what had already been made clear. King Charles understood this instinctively. In the days that followed, he made no public gestures designed to counterbalance the weight of the announcement. There were no surprise appearances, no symbolic engagements staged to project continuity. His restraint was itself a message. The monarchy would not perform resilience as spectacle. It would practice it privately. Behind closed doors, preparations accelerated, not with urgency, but with inevitability. Plans that had existed as contingencies were revisited and refined. Responsibilities were subtly redistributed without public explanation. Those within the institution recognized the shift immediately. Authority did not move abruptly, but it leaned forward. Prince William's role began to change in ways that were perceptible even without a formal announcement. His presence at briefings increased. His involvement in long-range planning deepened. The distinction between supporting and leading narrowed, not because of ambition, but necessity. The future had drawn closer, and with it came a gravity that no amount of preparation could fully mitigate. For the wider family, the acknowledgement forced a recalibration of relationships. Some bonds tightened under the weight of shared reality, others strained not from conflict but from the quiet recognition that paths were diverging. Tragedy has a way of clarifying priorities, and not everyone arrives at the same conclusions. Public response continued to evolve. Initial analysis gave way to reflection. The absence of follow-up statements created space for restraint, something increasingly rare in moments of public grief. Without constant commentary from the palace, speculation slowed. The clarity of the original acknowledgement left little room for narrative expansion. Media coverage shifted accordingly. Rather than chasing fragments of information, outlets began contextualizing the moment historically. Comparisons were drawn to earlier periods when the monarchy faced irreversible change. What distinguished this moment, many noted, was not the severity of circumstance, but the manner of response. There had been no attempt to reframe reality as resilience. The family had allowed the truth to stand without embellishment. That choice carried consequences beyond reputation. It altered expectations. The public, having been addressed candidly, recalibrated its relationship with the institution. Sympathy replaced suspicion in many quarters, not because the situation was resolved, but because it had been named honestly. Inside the palace, this shift was noted with cautious relief. Trust, once eroded, is rarely restored quickly, but it can be stabilized. Princess Anne had not repaired her confidence through charm or sentiment. She had stabilized it through credibility. That distinction mattered deeply to those tasked with guiding the institution through what lay ahead. The emotional toll within the family remained largely unseen, as it always had. Acknowledgement did not lessen grief. It simply removed the burden of pretending that grief was not approaching. Private moments were afforded greater protection now that secrecy no longer served as a shield. In some ways, truth created space for privacy rather than destroying it. As weeks progressed, the absence of dramatic escalation became notable. No leaks contradicted the statement, no anonymous briefings attempting to soften its meaning. The family held the line. That discipline reinforced the seriousness of what had been shared. Silence in this context became a continuation of honesty rather than avoidance. Long-term implications began to surface quietly. Discussions about modernization took on new urgency. The balance between privacy and public duty was re-examined not as theory, but practice. Decisions once deferred out of fear of destabilization were reconsidered through a new lens. Stability, it became clear, did not depend on concealment. Princess Anne's role in this recalibration was subtle but decisive. Though she rarely spoke publicly after the announcement, her influence was felt in tone and approach. She advocated for fewer statements, not more. For clarity and reassurance, for consistency over reaction. Those principles shaped subsequent actions. When engagements were adjusted, they were adjusted quietly. When responsibilities shifted, they shifted without commentary. The institution moved forward without insisting that forward movement meant optimism. For Prince William, this period marked the beginning of a different kind of preparation. No longer abstract, his future responsibilities became tangible. He navigated this transition without public display, guided by the understanding that leadership in moments like this is demonstrated through steadiness rather than declaration. The public, observing from a distance, sensed this shift even without explicit markers. Analysts noted a change in tone, not only in official communications but in presence. The monarchy appeared less performative, more deliberate. That change was not universally praised, but it was widely respected. The tragedy acknowledged by Princess Anne did not conclude the story. It reframed it. What followed was not resolution, but adaptation. The family moved from anticipation to acceptance, from preparation to practice. In the end, the most enduring consequence of the moment was not the news itself, but the precedent it set. That when circumstances demanded truth, the institution would not hide behind language or delay behind process. It would speak plainly once and stand by what it said. That choice did not make the future easier, but it made it clearer. And clarity, in moments of irreversible change, is its own form of strength.